Clara Bennett had learned over the course of 3 years working inside the Harlow estate that silence had textures. There was the cold silence of the marble hallways in the early morning when her footsteps echoed against stone floors that cost more per square foot than her monthly rent. There was the heavy silence of the East Wing Library, where walls of leather-bound books absorbed every sound and made the air feel thick, almost sacred. And then there was the silence that followed Mr. Harlow himself, a particular kind of quiet that clung to his presence like a second shadow, radiating something between authority and loneliness. Ethan Harlow was 36 years old, the sole heir to a real estate empire that stretched across 14 states, and the most emotionally inaccessible man Clara had ever encountered in her life. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make unnecessary conversation. He moved through his own home the way a stranger might pass through an airport, with purpose, with indifference, with the particular efficiency of someone who never intends to stay long. Clara, at 28, was the opposite of all that. She noticed things, small things. The way the light changed in the dining room between 7 and 8 in the morning, turning the cream-colored walls briefly golden. The way a certain vase on the second-floor landing always drifted 3 inches to the left, no matter how many times she repositioned it, as though the house itself had opinions about decoration. The way Mr. Harlow always left exactly 2 fingers of Scotch at the bottom of his glass at night, never finishing it, never explaining why. She had told herself, many times, that noticing things was just part of her job. That it was professional attentiveness, not personal interest. She believed this with the determination of someone who knows they are lying to themselves, but has decided the lie is necessary. The Harlow estate sat on 40 acres of Connecticut countryside, a 19th-century stone manor that had been renovated so precisely that it felt both historic and clinical, all original fireplaces and high ceilings paired with invisible heating systems and lighting that adjusted automatically to the time of day. There were 11 bedrooms, 4 sitting rooms, 2 kitchens, a wine cellar, a greenhouse, and a staff of 6 that included Clara, a groundskeeper named Douglas, who spoke almost exclusively about weather patterns, a private chef named Marco who treated every meal as a personal audition, and 3 part-time assistants who rotated depending on the week's schedule. Clara was the head of household staff. It was a title that sounded more impressive than it was. What it meant practically was that she arrived first and left last, that she knew where everything was kept and how everything was managed, and that when something went wrong, which it did regularly in a house this size, she was the one who fixed it. She was good at her job, exceptionally good, in the quiet, unassuming way that people with real competence tend to be. She didn't seek praise and rarely received it. Mr. Harlow acknowledged her work with brief nods and the occasional clipped thank you that he delivered, without looking up from whatever document he was reviewing. For a long time, she had told herself that was enough. It had been enough, until the morning 6 weeks ago when she'd arrived early to find him already in the kitchen, standing at the counter in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, reading the newspaper with a cup of coffee gone cold beside him. He hadn't heard her come in, and for a moment she had simply stood in the doorway watching him, the unhurried slope of his shoulders, the way his brow furrowed slightly at something he read, the unconscious way he reached for the cold coffee and drank it without noticing it had stopped being warm. He'd looked up. Their eyes had met across the length of the kitchen. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he'd said, in that even voice of his already folding the newspaper. "Good morning, Mr. Harlow," she'd replied, and moved to her station with the mechanical ease of long practice. But something had shifted in the room that morning, or perhaps in her chest, and she'd spent the following weeks pretending it hadn't. She was good at pretending. She'd had practice. Clara had grown up in Albany, the second of 3 daughters to a woman who had cleaned other people's houses her entire working life, and a father who had left when Clara was 11 and been replaced, with remarkable thoroughness, by silence. She'd put herself through 2 years of hotel management school before realizing the degree was expensive and the industry paid poorly, and had fallen sideways into private household staffing through a recruitment agency that placed domestic workers in the homes of the extremely wealthy. She'd worked in 2 other estates before the Harlow position: a retired senator's house in Virginia and a tech heiress's penthouse in Manhattan, and she'd learned quickly that the rules of engagement in these environments were simple: be invisible, be competent, and never, under any circumstances, become emotionally invested in the family. She had followed those rules faithfully for years, standing now in the East Wing hallway with a fresh arrangement of white peonies balanced in her arms. Mr. Harlow's late mother had loved peonies, and so the house always had them, a detail that Clara had discovered in a household manual and that had softened her opinion of him slightly against her better judgment. She heard voices coming from the direction of the main sitting room. That was unusual. Mr. Harlow didn't often have guests on a Thursday morning. She set the vases down on the console table and moved toward the sound with the unhurried pace of someone who belongs in every room of a house, which she did. Through the half-open door, she saw Ethan standing near the window, his posture more rigid than usual. Across from him sat a woman Clara had never seen before, dark-haired, expensively dressed, with the particular poise of someone who had been beautiful for so long that it had become boring to them. She was laughing at something, and the laugh was practiced, musical, landing exactly where a laugh was supposed to land. "I just think it's time," the woman was saying. "Your board agrees. Your mother would have agreed, frankly." "My mother's opinions are not available for speculation, Diana," Ethan said, and there was an edge beneath the evenness of his voice that Clara recognized, the edge he deployed when a conversation had gone somewhere he hadn't consented to go. Clara stepped back from the door. She collected her flowers and moved toward the staircase, and she did not think about the conversation she'd just heard, or about the woman's laugh, or about the particular way Ethan's jaw had tightened when he'd said his mother's name. She thought instead about the week's schedule, about the linen order that needed confirming, about the guttering on the north face of the house that Douglas had flagged as needing attention before the autumn rains began. She thought about everything that wasn't Ethan Harlow. She was still thinking about everything that wasn't Ethan Harlow when she nearly collided with him in the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the back stairwell, a servant's passageway that no one used except Clara, and apparently this morning, the owner of the house. They stopped 2 feet apart. He was holding his phone, which he lowered. "Miss Bennett." "Mr. Harlow. I'm sorry, I didn't realize." "No." He paused. The corridor was close. "I've been meaning to tell you. The arrangements in the library, the ones you've been doing with the dried lavender." He stopped again. "They're good. My mother would have liked them." Clara looked at him. In 3 years, he had never said anything like that. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means a lot." He nodded once, the way he did, and moved past her. She stood still in the corridor for a long moment after he'd gone, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade into the marble silence of the house. In her coat pocket, her phone buzzed with a message. She pulled it out. It was from her old college friend, Ryan Caldwell, whom she hadn't spoken to in almost a year. "Hey, stranger. I'm in Hartford for 3 weeks for work. Let me take you to dinner." "Friday?" Clara looked at the message for a long moment. Then she looked down the corridor where Ethan had disappeared. She typed back, "Friday works." "I'd love that." She had no idea, as she pressed send, that one dinner with Ryan Caldwell would change every single thing. Friday arrived the way late September Fridays do in Connecticut, with a sky the color of pale ash and a wind that hadn't decided yet whether it wanted to be cold. Clara finished her shift at the estate at 5:30, changed in the small staff bathroom on the ground floor, and drove the 40 minutes to Hartford in her 10-year-old Honda that protested every hill with a sound like a tired sigh. Ryan Caldwell was already at the restaurant when she arrived, a corner Italian place on Trumbull Street with red-checked tablecloths and candles in wine bottles that had been there since what looked like the early 80s and hadn't felt the need to update. He stood when he saw her come in, and Clara was struck, as she sometimes was when she saw old friends after long absences, by how familiar and strange a person could be at the same time. Ryan had been her closest friend during the 2 years of hotel management school. He was 30 years old now, broad-shouldered, with the kind of easy smile that made people feel immediately at ease. He worked in commercial architecture, travelled constantly for projects, and had what Clara had always privately considered a gift for being present, for making whoever he was with feel like the most interesting person in the room. He hugged her with genuine warmth, and she felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized had been tightened. "You look exactly the same," he said, which wasn't true, and they both knew it, but the intention behind it was kind. "You got taller somehow," she said, which also wasn't true, and they both laughed. They ordered wine and pasta and talked the way old friends do when enough time has passed to skip the small talk and go straight to the real things. Ryan told her about a project he was managing in Prague, a residential complex commissioned by a European developer, and about the strange loneliness of hotel rooms in cities where he didn't speak the language. Clara told him about the estate, about Douglas and his weather observations, about Marco's increasingly theatrical approach to Thursday night dinners. She did not mention Ethan Harlow, or rather, she mentioned him the way you mention a piece of furniture, briefly, functionally, in the context of describing the house. "My employer prefers the East Wing for morning meetings. My employer travels to New York the second week of every month. The word employer doing a great deal of work, carrying weight it wasn't built for," Ryan noticed. He had always been observant in that relaxed, unhurried way of his. "This employer," he said, refilling her glass. "What's he like?" "Efficient," Clara said. Ryan smiled. "That's a word you use for a dishwasher." "He runs a large company. He's private. He's—" She stopped, searching for the right description and finding that none of them were quite right. "He's complicated," she finished. "Complicated like difficult, or complicated like interesting?" She looked at him across the candlelight. "Both," she said honestly, and then regretted it. Ryan studied her for a moment with the same unhurried attentiveness he'd always had. Then he picked up his wine and changed the subject with the grace of someone who knows when to leave a door closed, and Clara was grateful. They stayed until the restaurant began stacking chairs around them, talking about everything and nothing, and when they said goodbye outside on the sidewalk in the September wind, Ryan pulled her into another hug and said, "3 weeks, remember? I want to see you again before I leave." "I'll hold you to that," she said, and meant it. She drove home feeling lighter than she had in months. She didn't expect Ethan to notice anything. He was not, in her experience, a man who paid attention to the personal lives of his staff. Not cruelly. It wasn't indifference born of contempt, more of a clean professional separation that she had always respected and had, until recently, maintained just as carefully herself. But on Monday morning, when she arrived at 7 to find him already at the breakfast table with the newspaper and a coffee that was still hot this time, he looked up and said, without preamble, "You were out Friday evening." Clara set down the folder she was carrying. "I had a personal engagement, yes, I cleared it with the Thursday schedule. Douglas was on call and Marco—" "I'm not questioning the scheduling," he said. He looked back at his newspaper. "I noticed your car was gone late, that's all." She waited a moment. "Is there something you need, Mr. Harlow?" He turned a page. "No." She left the room with the particular stillness she had perfected over 3 years, no hurry, no visible reaction, and stood in the corridor outside with her back against the stone wall and her folder pressed to her chest, thinking, he noticed. It meant nothing. Probably. She told herself it meant nothing for the rest of the morning. Ryan texted her on Wednesday. "There's a jazz bar on Asylum Street. Thursday evening, before you say no, they do excellent old fashions, and I found parking nearby, which in Hartford is basically a miracle." She laughed at her phone in the pantry alone in a way she immediately felt self-conscious about. She wrote back, "Thursday works." She didn't mention it to Ethan. She had no reason to mention it to Ethan. It was not, in any configuration she could imagine, his business. But Thursday came, and she and Ryan spent 3 hours in a dim bar with a 4-piece jazz band and genuinely excellent cocktails, and she told him things she hadn't told anyone in a long time. About her mother, about Albany, about the specific, particular loneliness of working in beautiful houses that belong to other people. And Ryan listened with his whole attention the way he always had, and she remembered why she had valued his friendship so much. And somewhere between the second and third old-fashioned, she thought, "This is good." This is exactly what I needed. She didn't think about Ethan Harlow once, or almost not once. On Friday morning, she arrived at the estate to find Ethan standing in the entrance hall with his phone in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite decode. Not quite a frown, but something adjacent to one, something that lived in the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning." He looked at her for a half-second longer than usual. "You were out again last night." Clara set her bag on the hall table. She turned to face him with the steady composure that was her greatest professional asset. "I was. Is that a problem, Mr. Harlow?" A pause. Short, but she felt it. "No," he said. "Of course not." He moved past her toward the study. She watched him go. It was Douglas who told her, without realizing he was telling her anything, when she found him raking leaves near the east gate at midday. Himself was out in the garden last evening, Douglas said in his meandering way. "Just walking, nearly 9 o'clock. Don't usually see him out that late in the week." Clara said nothing. She looked toward the house. "Looked like a man with something on his mind," Douglas added philosophically, and returned to his raking. That afternoon, the woman from the sitting room, Diana, arrived again. This time, Clara was in the upstairs corridor when she heard them in the entrance hall below. "You've been distant," Diana was saying. Her voice traveled well. "I've been busy," Ethan said. "You're always busy. I mean something else, and you know it." There was a silence that Clara had no business interpreting. "Diana." "There's someone else," the woman said. Not a question. A statement, delivered with the flat precision of someone who has already calculated the answer and simply wants the equation confirmed. The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Clara counted them without meaning to. "Don't be dramatic," Ethan said, and his voice had the careful, pressed quality of a man editing himself in real time. Clara moved away from the top of the stairs. She walked to the library and closed the door gently, and stood among the books in the thick, book-absorbed silence. And she did not think about those 3 seconds. She thought about Ryan instead, about how uncomplicated he was, about how easy it was to breathe around him. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. "Saturday dinner? I want to take you somewhere with an actual view this time," she typed back immediately, before she could think about it. Yes. Absolutely yes. When she looked up, the library door was open. Ethan was standing in the doorway. She didn't know how long he'd been there. His expression, for just a moment, was completely unguarded, and what she saw in it, before the professional mask reassembled itself, stopped every thought in her head. "I need the Henderson file from the cabinet," he said, perfectly even. "Of course," she said, perfectly even. Neither of them acknowledged what had just happened, but something had. Something had definitely just happened. The Henderson file turned out to be exactly where it always was. 3rd drawer, left cabinet, behind the property assessments for the Rhode Island portfolio. Clara retrieved it with steady hands and set it on the reading table without a word. Ethan took it without a word, and the library returned to its usual silence, as though nothing had passed between them in the doorway, as though she hadn't seen what she'd seen in his face for that brief, unguarded moment. She told herself she had imagined it. She was good at telling herself things. Saturday came with actual sunlight, which felt like a personal favor from the season. Ryan picked her up at the bottom of the estate's private road. She had given him the intersection rather than the address. Out of a habit of compartmentalization she didn't fully examine, and drove them to a restaurant perched on the edge of a reservoir outside the city, the kind of place with wide windows and wooden tables and a menu that changed weekly based on what was local and available. The view was exactly as promised. Water and sky and the early color of October beginning to bleed into the tree lines on the far bank. They ate slowly and talked easily, and Clara felt for the 4th time in 2 weeks the particular relief of being with someone who required nothing complicated from her. Ryan was good company in the way that genuinely good people are good company, not through performance, but through genuine interest in the world around him and in the person sitting across from him. "Can I ask you something direct?" he said, somewhere between the main course and dessert. "You've never asked permission before," she said. He smiled. "Are you happy, Clara? In that house? With that life?" She looked at the reservoir. The light on the water was doing something very beautiful that she filed away automatically. The way she filed away beautiful things, storing them for later, for evenings alone in her apartment, when she needed to remember that the world had texture. "I'm good at my job," she said. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "I know." Ryan turned his wineglass by the stem. "I ask because I'm going to say something, and I want you to know it's not coming from nowhere. We've been friends for years, Clara. Real friends. And being around you these past 2 weeks has reminded me of something I think I let slide past me a long time ago." She looked at him then. "I think I've been a little bit in love with you since hotel management school," he said, with the straightforward calm of a man who has decided the truth is simpler than the alternative. "I'm not saying that to complicate things. I'm saying it because I'm leaving in 10 days and I don't want to leave without having said it." The reservoir reflected the sky. Someone at a table near the window laughed at something, and the sound was warm and uncomplicated. Clara opened her mouth and then closed it. "You don't have to say anything back," and Ryan said. "I mean it, I just wanted you to know." She thought about what he'd said the entire drive home. She thought about it while she unlocked her apartment door, and while she stood in her kitchen drinking a glass of water in the dark, and while she lay in bed watching the ceiling with the alert stillness of someone whose mind has decided sleep is not currently on the agenda. Ryan was kind. Ryan was present. Ryan made her feel like a person rather than a function, and he was leaving in 10 days, which meant that whatever this was had a natural edge to it, a built-in limit that made it feel both safer and sadder than it should. She thought about what she wanted. Then, despite everything, she thought about the library doorway. She pushed the thought away with the efficiency of long practice. Monday morning arrived with rain and a minor household crisis in the form of a burst pipe in the second-floor bathroom that Douglas discovered at 6:15 and that required Clara to be at the estate by 6:30, phone in hand, coordinating with a plumber and rerouting the Tuesday linen delivery while simultaneously ensuring Marco had an alternate prep space for the breakfast service. She was good in crises. She always had been. She moved through the next 90 minutes with the calm efficiency that had made her indispensable to this house and to this man. And by 8 o'clock the plumber had arrived, the linen was rerouted, Marco had adapted with only moderate theatrical suffering, and the situation was under control. She was reviewing the repair estimate at the kitchen table when Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had clearly been up since before the crisis. He was already dressed, a coffee in hand, and he'd read the situation with a single glance at the plumber's van outside. "Pipe?" he said. "Second floor, north bathroom. Likely a seal failure. They'll have it done by noon." He nodded. He came into the kitchen and sat down across from her, which he didn't usually do, and looked at the estimate she was reviewing. He reached across the table and turned the page toward himself, reading without asking, which was also unusual. "Tell them to replace the adjacent fitting as well," he said. "That bathroom was last serviced 6 years ago. If one seal went, the others are close behind." "I'll add it," she said, making the note. He didn't leave. He sat with his coffee and she sat with her paperwork, and for several minutes the kitchen held the comfortable silence of two people who have spent enough time in proximity to have learned each other's rhythms. Then he said, without looking up from his coffee, "The man you've been seeing." Clara went very still. "I'm not asking," he said, as though he could hear the objection forming. "I realize it's not my business. I'm simply aware that you've had several evening engagements recently, and that you seem—" He paused. "Different. Different," she repeated. "Lighter," he said, and said it like it cost him something. The rain hit the kitchen windows in a sudden gust. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table. "He's an old friend," she said carefully. "He's here temporarily for work. He leaves in 10 days. Something crossed Ethan's face, too quickly for her to name. "I see," he said. He finished his coffee, stood, and left the room. The plot twist arrived on Wednesday, and it arrived through Diana. Clara was arranging the weekly flowers in the front entrance hall when the woman let herself in. She apparently had a code for the gate, which Clara noted with a distinct lack of pleasure, and swept through with the brisk confidence of someone who considers a space partly their own. She stopped when she saw Clara. "You're the housekeeper," she said. "Head of household staff," Clara said pleasantly, the way she said everything at work. Diana looked at her with the particular attention of a woman recalibrating. It was a thorough look, the kind that took inventory. "He talks about you," she said finally. "Ethan, not a great deal. He doesn't talk about anything a great deal. But you come up. The way things that matter come up when someone's trying not to talk about them." Clara kept her hands on the flowers. "Mr. Harlow is a very professional employer." "Yes," Diana said dryly. "He's very professional about a great many things." She paused. "For what it's worth, and I imagine this will seem strange coming from me, I'm not his girlfriend. I never have been. I'm his family's estate attorney. I've been pushing him to consider certain personal decisions for 2 years now, and he deflects with the particular stubbornness of a man who is waiting for something without admitting he's waiting." Clara said nothing. She was very focused on a peony. "He's a complicated man," Diana said. "So I've heard," Clara said. Diana smiled, not the practiced laugh from the sitting room, but something more genuine underneath it. "Don't let him wait too long," she said, as though this were a perfectly normal thing to say to a housekeeper in an entrance hall. Men like Ethan Harlow are extraordinarily good at standing very close to what they want and never reaching for it. She moved past her toward the study. Clara stood among the peonies for a long moment. The rain had cleared. Afternoon light came through the high entrance windows and fell across the marble floor in long gold rectangles. 10 days, she thought. Ryan was leaving in 10 days. And something else, something she had been carefully not naming for 3 years, was either going to happen or it wasn't. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it expecting Ryan. It was Ethan, a text, which he had never, in 3 years, sent her for anything other than scheduling. "Could you come to the study when you have a moment? Not urgent, I'd like to talk." She read it 3 times. She had spent 3 years learning the textures of this house's silence. She had never heard it sound quite like that. Clara stood in the entrance hall for a full minute after reading the message, the phone warm in her hand and the afternoon light still doing its slow, golden work across the marble floor. Then she set down the last peony, smoothed the front of her uniform with the automatic gesture of someone buying time with small actions, and walked toward the study. The door was half open. She knocked twice, lightly, the way she always did. "Come in," he said. Ethan was standing at the window rather than sitting at his desk, which was the first unusual thing. The second unusual thing was that the desk itself was clear. No documents, no open laptop, no evidence of the perpetual industry that normally occupied every surface of the room. He had his hands in his pockets, and he was looking out at the grounds, where the rain-washed lawns were catching the last of the afternoon light and turning it into something briefly extraordinary. He turned when she came in. He looked, she thought, like a man who had prepared something to say and then thought better of it at the last moment and was now navigating without a map. "I owe you an apology," he said. Clara waited. "I've been intrusive about your personal life. The questions about where you'd been, the comments about your evenings." He stopped. "It wasn't appropriate. You're not accountable to me for your time outside this house, and I behaved as though you were. I'm sorry for that." She studied him. In 3 years she had never heard him apologize for anything, not because he was arrogant. She had worked for arrogant men and knew the species well, but because he was so precisely careful in his actions that he rarely created situations requiring apology. This was different. This was a man standing at a window he had positioned himself at deliberately in a cleared room, delivering words he had chosen in advance. "I accept your apology," she said, "though I didn't take offense." "You should have," he said quietly. "It wasn't professional." "No," she agreed. "It wasn't." A silence settled, not the cold marble silence of the hallways or the thick absorbed silence of the library. Something else. something with more air in it and more risk. "Diana spoke to me this morning," he said. Clara kept her expression neutral. "She mentioned she was stopping by. She told me she'd spoken to you yesterday." He paused. "She told me what she said." Clara said nothing. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud shifted somewhere above the house. "She's been telling me for 2 years that I live like a man who's waiting," he said. He wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was looking at her. "I told her she was being dramatic. I told myself the same thing." A pause. "I'm not sure I believed it either time." Clara felt something move in her chest, that careful, guarded thing she had been managing for months, shifting in a way that was becoming difficult to manage. "Mr. Harlow," she began. "Ethan," he said. "Please, if this is a different kind of conversation, I'd prefer it." She looked at him. "Ethan," she said, and the word felt strange and right in the same moment. "I think you should say what you're trying to say." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the evenness he always carried, but underneath it, something uncharacteristically undefended. "I noticed you the way you notice something that changes the quality of a room," he said. "Not all at once, gradually, and then completely. And I didn't do anything about it because I was certain it was inappropriate and because I am, not someone who handles uncertainty well. So I said nothing and managed nothing, and then you started going out in the evenings and coming back different, and I handled that very poorly." "You did," she said, something almost like a smile. "I did. The comments about my car," she said, embarrassing in retrospect. "The expression when I mentioned he was leaving in 10 days. A pause. "I didn't realize that was visible." "It was visible," she said, and she heard something soften in her own voice that she hadn't authorized. He took a breath. For a man who was always in control of the air he occupied, it was a remarkably unsteady breath. "I'm not asking you to disregard the position you're in, or the position I'm in," he said. "I'm aware that what I'm about to say complicates things significantly, and I want you to know that however you respond, nothing about your situation here changes. That's not a condition. It's just, I need you to know it's true before I say anything else." "Okay," she said. "I'm in love with you," he said. "I've been in love with you for longer than I've been willing to admit to myself, and watching you be happy these past 2 weeks, even knowing it was because of someone else, was one of the more instructive experiences of my life because it showed me exactly what I was choosing to waste by saying nothing." The study held the words. Outside, a bird called once from somewhere in the grounds and went quiet. Clara looked at Ethan Harlow, this precise, private, complicated man who left 2 fingers of Scotch in his glass every night and had never replaced his mother's peonies and had been standing very close to what he wanted for 3 years without reaching for it. And she felt everything she had been carefully not naming rise to the surface with the unstoppable patience of something that had always been there, waiting for exactly this. "I need to make a phone call," she said. He blinked. Of all the responses he had prepared for, this was evidently not among them. "Now?" "Yes. Give me 10 minutes." She stepped out of the study and walked to the small sitting room at the end of the corridor, and she called Ryan. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Ryan," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I mean it with genuine care and genuine gratitude for the past 2 weeks." A pause. She heard him understand, the way perceptive people understand things before she'd said it. "Okay," he said quietly. "What you told me Saturday, I was moved by it. Truly. You are one of the best people I know. And being around you reminded me of things about myself I'd let go quiet." She paused. "But I'm not in love with you, I'm sorry." A silence. Then, in the voice of a man who is genuinely good and knows when to let something go with grace, "Is it him? The complicated employer?" She almost laughed. "Yes." "I figured," Ryan said. "You didn't say his name once at dinner, Clara. In 4 evenings. That's not how you talk about an employer." "I know," she said. "Are you happy?" She looked down the corridor toward the study. where Ethan was standing in a cleared room having said the most undefended thing she suspected he'd ever said to another person. "I think I'm about to be," she said. Ryan laughed, easy, warm, entirely without bitterness. "Go then, and don't disappear for another year." "I won't," she promised. "Ryan, thank you for coming back." "Thank him," Ryan said. "Apparently I made him jealous enough to finally open his mouth." She laughed this time properly and ended the call. She walked back to the study. Ethan was still at the window. He turned when she came in, and she could see the careful control he was holding himself with. The stillness of a man waiting for a verdict he is trying to prepare himself for either way. She crossed the room, not to the chair across from his desk, where she had sat in 100 professional conversations. She walked to the window, where he was standing, and stopped close enough that the particular quality of his silence became something she was inside of, rather than observing from a distance. 3 years, she said. "You could have said something 3 years ago." "I know," he said. "I'm aware. I would have had feelings a great deal sooner if you'd said something 3 years ago." He went very still. I noticed you," she said. "The way you notice something that changes the quality of a room." She used his own words deliberately, and watched them register in his face. Not all at once, gradually, and then completely. For the first time in 3 years, Ethan Harlow looked entirely unguarded. No professional mask, no careful evenness. Just a man, undone in the best possible way, standing in the afternoon light of his own study. "Clara," he said, and just her name in his voice, plain and undefended, was enough. She reached up and straightened his collar, a small, entirely unnecessary gesture that had nothing to do with household management, and everything to do with the simple fact that she wanted to touch him, and this was how her hands knew to begin. He covered her hand with his and held it there. Outside, the Connecticut afternoon continued its unhurried business. Douglas was probably checking the guttering on the north face. Marco was probably workshopping Thursday's menu with excessive intensity. The house went on being a house, marble and peonies and old books and all the layered silences she had spent 3 years learning. But this room right now had found a new texture entirely. Later, weeks later, and then months, people would ask how it had happened. Diana would claim full credit with serene satisfaction. Douglas would say he'd seen it coming from the garden and had simply been waiting for the rest of them to catch up. Marco would say nothing useful, but would begin adding an extra dessert course on Friday evenings, which was his particular way of celebrating things. Clara would say only that it had happened the way important things tend to happen, not all at once, but gradually, and then completely, and then in a cleared room on a rain-washed afternoon, when someone finally decided that standing close to what they wanted was no longer enough. Ethan would say even less, but he would stop leaving 2 fingers of Scotch at the bottom of his glass. He would finish it every time,